Okay, you guys ready to talk about cost behavior? I think we're on page 9 of your workbook. Be still my heart. Cost behavior. Woo! All right, we are going to talk about cost behavior. Now, if you take a real quick look at page 9, but also flip over to page 10, they go together. We're going to talk about costs from the standpoint of, first of all, on page 9, direct and indirect, which relates to what concept of costing? What does it say on the top of your page 9? Does it say?
Product?
Yes! There we go, good. Product or service costing, right? So in a world where we have multiple products or services, we want to get all of our costs to those products or services. Why would we want to do that? So we know whether they're profitable or get guidance on how we should price them to be profitable, right? So we have that realm. Now if you flip over the page real quick, we also, and it's related, talk about costs as either fixed, variable, or semi-variable. Now the perspective here is more from a forecasting standpoint. As different things happen, as the business goes up or down, certain business events happen, we want to be able to predict how costs are going to behave. Why in the world would we want to be able to do that?
It's going to impact cash flow.
Sure, it's going to impact cash flow. We need to plan for resources. We need to know when we're going to be able to draw on cash balances or contribute to cash balances, when we might need to draw on a line of credit or be able to pay down a line of credit. We need to know aspects of when resources need to be available and how that's going to happen. It's all a forecasting perspective. So we're going to spend the next several minutes talking about that. Then we're going to do a little activity over on page 11 related to that to kind of set that in. Now, once we're done with that, we're going to talk about concepts of calculating break-even point, and we're going to talk about concepts of depreciation. And that's pretty much the cost section. Does that sound good? All right, here we go. So we're going to build out a little example of a bicycle manufacturing company that makes and sells 3 different kinds of bikes: kids' bikes, street bikes, and mountain bikes. Now, in the direct variable category, we have these things called direct labor and direct material. Now, in the world of bikes, what might be some examples of direct material? Tires, good. Frames. The specific elements that make the specific bikes. So here's the thing about direct costs and what I'd like you to write on page 9 under direct costs. All right? These are costs that it's very easy to see which products they go to. It's very easy to see which products they go to. So what we do in our accounting system is we charge them directly to those products. And the 2 biggest examples of that are direct labor and direct material. There are other examples, but the costs of the actual hard materials that go into the individual products and the cost of assembling them or putting them together or making them. Does that make sense? Okay, good. And the thing about direct costs is they are direct, they are easy to see. So in the ledger structure of the accounting structure, we actually have special accounts set up just for the different labor and material costs associated with those products to charge into. Okay. Now, the other types of costs when it comes to direct and indirect are indirect costs. These are more costs that we incur at the overall company level or on a broad way. It's still important that these get to the individual products and services, but because we cannot charge them directly, because it's not necessarily obvious which costs or which products that these particular elements of costs go to, instead of charging them directly, we have to allocate them. Allocate them. So we allocate indirect costs. Now, we want to think a little bit about the way we allocate indirect costs, right? Because there are some kind of standard methodologies that people use to allocate indirect costs. So, for example, if kids' bikes were 20% of my business, street bikes were 30% of my business, and mountain bikes were 50% of my business, then I could take the unit sales as a percentage of the total and use that as an allocation mechanism. I could take percentage of revenue because the pricing on those different types of bikes might be. But are there other ways to allocate costs that might be more accurate? And why do we want those to be accurate? Can some of those broad methods of doing indirect cost allocation actually lead us to believe that some products are more expensive or less expensive than others? And if we make that mistake, what follow-on mistake do we make? Profit or pricing mistakes, right? So big chunks of costs we want to be, let's take the concept of liability. We have insurance down here. Let's take product liability insurance. Now, if kids' bikes are 20%, street bikes are 30%, and mountain bikes are 50% of our business, do you think that's the way the product liability insurance bill is going to lay out? Which one do you think is going to have more than its percentage of sales, unit sales of product liability insurance? Okay, some people do say kids. Mountain bikes, though, is what I would think, right? Because, these people go off of cliffs. And if their wife is taking them around Applegate Lake, sometimes what they do is, if they don't really know how to ride a mountain bike well, sometimes they tip over and crack their ribs on rocks. Sometimes like that. And sometimes they blame those things on the actual, bike, because it didn't turn right or whatever. So big things like that. And the one thing I'd like you to write down under indirect costs is be careful about your allocation mechanisms. Make sure they make sense. And let's talk about these same costs, but from a fixed and variable perspective. Now here we're talking about being able to forecast costs. So I believe the first item at the top of your page is what kind of cost? Fixed, yeah. Now, fixed costs are pretty easy to forecast, right? Because within fairly broad ranges of business activity, they stay pretty stable, pretty flat. So things like administrative costs, general utilities, insurance, overhead, stuff like that stays pretty flat across a pretty broad range of business activity. I do want to differentiate something, though. In a place like this that has cold seasons and hot seasons, what's the deal with utilities? When are now think about this before you answer it. When are utilities actually the least? Spring and fall, right? And they're the highest in the winter and summer. So obviously, when you're forecasting those elements of utility costs, you want to take that seasonality into effect. When we talk about fixed and variable from the standpoint of forecasting based on business drivers, we're not talking about seasonality. We're also not talking about fluctuating fuel costs or fuel prices, even though those are also elements that need to be factored in to what's going to happen with those elements of costs. What we're talking about with fixed and variable is their relationships to underlying business drivers. Write that at the top of your page 10. These costs relationships to underlying business drivers, like sales volume, like any types of business activities. Because with variable costs, we're going to build those relationships. Go ahead and write that down, and then we'll keep going down this path. It'll be more obvious when we do our activities here in just a couple of minutes. Now, how many of you all forecast in Microsoft Excel, using Excel? Okay. What we're, of course, talking about here when we break these things down into these different categories is how you build the relationship when we're talking about fixed variable and semi-variable to the underlying business driver, like sales volume, like direct labor hours worked, like number of products, like miles driven, whatever those underlying business drivers are. You're really forecasting those business drivers. And then for the second category down on that page, variable costs, you're establishing a per unit relationship to those business drivers. Let's talk about a couple of examples relative to our bicycle manufacturing company. Remember those bicycle seats? Remember those bicycle seats? $10 per seat, right? Those happen to be kids' bicycle seats that were $10 per seat, all right? So if I do 1,000 bikes in January, how much do I have in terms of bicycle seat costs? $10,000. If I do 2,000 kids' bikes in February, how much do I have in terms of bicycle seat costs? So 2,000 times 20,000, right? So you see how we're doing the calculation. We're taking the number of bikes we sell times a per unit relationship to the underlying cost category. And that's the way variable costs work. Variable costs go up or down proportionally to the underlying business element. Here, bicycles sold. Oh, that life were so simple. That we just had fixed costs that don't change and variable costs that have this perfectly linear relationship to, in this case, sales or production, right? But is it always that purty? No. In fact, in a real pure sense of the word, most of our costs actually fall into this third category that's down on page 10 called what? Semi-variable. Now what semi-variable costs are is they do track with business activity, just not one for one. Let me give you an example. Let's just say in this room right here, this is where we make our bikes. Now we flatten out the room, it's flatter. So we got it all set up in an assembly area. Now what we're doing is we're actually ramping up production. Actually, we'd be at peak production right now. We'd probably actually be tailing off for sales at Christmas, right? Because by this point, most of the stuff is in the process of either being delivered or already has been delivered through the retail channels to the retailers, right? But maybe in September and October, this is when we're making the bulk of our volume in here. So we actually make 50% more bikes in October than we made, or in September and October than we made like during the summer months on a per month basis. Are we gonna have 50%, are we gonna have more utilities? Yeah. Are we gonna have 50% more? No. So one example of a semi-variable cost is production utilities, for example. One of the costs that happens to go with employees is there's certain things you have to do for employees, right? Now, companies that think a lot about this, they invest in training for their employees. We like it when people do that, all right? So if you actually increase the number of employees you have by 50%, are you gonna have more training? All right? There's certain variable and semi-variable costs that go with employees, right? Are you gonna have 50% more training? Probably not, because probably not every person is gonna have like a per unit, like per attendee type charge. You're probably going to do some group training. We're able to leverage those expenses across groups of people. So training would be one of those semi-variable costs. The trick and the whole idea of taking a little bit of a gander at your business and categorizing your costs this way is because then this is the way you build your product or service costing models so you can price accurately. And it's the way you build your forecasting models so you can anticipate and do, for example, 12-month rolling cash flow forecasting. Does anybody do that? You build these relationships to the underlying drivers so you can anticipate what your needs are. So that's why we have these categories. Now, last thing to say about the categories before we go do a little activity here. Usually, not always, but usually, direct costs are variable costs. Does that make sense? Usually, but not always, fixed costs are indirect costs. But they're two different concepts, and do you see that? So usually when you're categorizing line items of costs, you want to categorize them as either direct, indirect, and fixed variable.